Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Last week I painted some squigs and they've been very unruly hanging around the studio with no one to keep them in line. So let's quickly paint a couple Night Goblins with contrast paints and a couple Vallejo Xpress Colors. I began with my favorite method of priming, starting with a gray primer all over, followed by a white spray from the top and sides. You could undercoat the models with white, gray sear, or wraithbone sprays and get great results too. For the first layer I'm using Orc Skin from Vallejo Xpress Color. Carefully paint it on one section at a time. Use a brush with a fine point and try your best to paint within the lines. The more accurate we are here, the less touch-up work we'll have to do later. I like to let the paint pool slightly, which will help darken the shadows, but it's important to avoid putting on so much paint that it runs off. Each color is different, so experiment and try painting different amounts until you get a feel for it and find the amount that works for you. With the base coat dry, I painted a shade with Biel-Tan green. Just like with the last layer, work on one section at a time and try to control where the paint pools. The more paint that pools in the cracks, the darker the shadows will be. Just be careful not to overdo it, otherwise the paint may drip. Now it's time for the robes. Rather than going with black right away, I'm painting a layer of Gryph-Charger gray first. The idea here is to darken the cloth slightly before applying the black. It will help give a smoother finish and also add a little blue tone to the final result. You could paint any kind of color here first if you want. Experiment and decide what you like best. Next I painted a layer of black Templar. It's easy for large, flat areas like the robes to end up looking splotchy and uneven. The gray undercoat helps even it out a little bit, but the most effective thing is all about how you lay down the black paint. Work on one section at a time and use a big brush if you can. Generally speaking, a large brush will leave a smoother mark. Don't be afraid to change your brush out for a smaller one when you get to a more detailed area. Now I'm switching back to the bigger brush. The fabric looks pretty good, and the finish is relatively even. You could leave it here if you want, and if I were painting 100 of these, I'd probably leave it here too. But since I'm only painting a couple models, I'm going to darken the shadows with more black Templar. This time, I'm going to paint it directly into a few of the folds and creases. I want to preserve the highlights, so I'm being careful not to paint over them. I want to add a decorative pattern around this goblin's hood, and it's really easy to do with just white paint. Begin with some white paint thinned with water, about equal parts, and get a very small amount on the brush. Paint some triangle shapes around the hood. By thinning the paint a lot, it's become transparent, and that means the base color will show through. In this case, it's making the white paint appear gray. Just make sure that your brush isn't too overloaded with paint. Too much and it will run. Generally speaking, the thinner the paint, the less you want on your brush. Next, go back to the white paint and grab some from the undiluted side. This paint will be stronger and more opaque. Take a very fine brush and trace along the edges of the triangle shapes. It's a real easy way to get multiple shades from just one color. simply by diluting the first layer more than the second. Next I painted the metal areas with Runelord brass and Iron Hand steel. I painted 2 or 3 layers of each to ensure a smooth, even finish. Don't worry about getting any paint on these strings. We'll be base coating them with an opaque paint later. One of my favorite shades for metal is an equal parts mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, a mix I affectionately call Armor Wash. I painted it all over the metal areas and allowed it to dry. Then I applied a second coat in some of the deepest recesses. I wanted the shade to collect more on the top side of these things, so I turned the model upside down to let gravity do the work for me. I painted about a third of each, quickly rinsed the brush, and then used the clean brush to blend out the edges. With the shading applied, I wanted to add some highlights with Canoptek alloy. Here's an easy way to make a bunch of scratches. Take an older brush with a blunt tip, grab a small amount of paint, and wiggle the brush side to side like this. If you do it right, it will make all the hairs separate. Then use a very light touch and paint the model. It's like painting with a dozen tiny brushes all at once. Make marks in a few different directions, focusing more of the scratches where the light will be hitting. I used the same technique to add scratches all over the armor with Stormhost silver. And after adding those scratches, I grabbed a smaller brush, still using Stormhost silver, and picked out a few of the topmost edges and corners. Next, I base coated the pouches and straps with Mournfang brown. Then I shaded those areas with Agrax Earthshade. I base coated the strings and teeth with Bonewhite. and when those areas were dry, I shaded them with Skeleton Horde. I painted the wooden stick and dagger handle with Cygor brown. Then I added a wood grain effect with a few thin lines of Gorthor brown. I painted the eyes with black Templar, as well as the earrings and the nails. Next, I picked out the teeth with white. I slipped and made a mistake here, but it'll be easy to correct in a second when the white dries. Just a little bit of thinned black paint and it's like it never happened. Next I added a little color to the bottom lip with Terradon Turquoise. Then I painted the eyes with Evil Sunz Scarlet, leaving a thin outline of black around the eyes. And finally I painted a dot of bright orange in the center. Next I painted the mushrooms with Magmadroth Flame. And then I painted the dots on them with Bonewhite. Followed by a highlight with white. This step is optional, but if you feel like highlighting the pouches, Mournfang brown works well. Then I mixed in some Bonewhite and highlighted a few of the edges. Finally, I painted the earrings with Retributor armor and Stormhost silver. I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue. Then I sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Steel Legion Drab. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with Agrax Earthshade. I painted the rim of the base with Rhinox hide, and then applied patches of static grass with super glue. And here are the finished Night Goblins, and hopefully they'll be able to keep those squigs in line. It's a really fast and easy paint scheme. which should make a whole army of these a lot more achievable. Do you want to see more fast army painting videos? What models would you like to see? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really helps the channel, and doing so will ensure you don't miss any future videos. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.